Guys, just checking the wording of the motion. This House believes that the Democratic Party should ignore all executive orders issued by the President and all federal laws. Right? Okay. Hi everyone, welcome to the quarterfinals of Health Pre-UADC. I'll be your chair, Subra. Pending with me, Deepan, Rupi, and Edwin. On this motion, we have Kayla's TKD in government. And in opposition, we have Pats Moobs. Without further ado, I would like to welcome the Prime Minister to begin the debate. Go ahead.
Our position is this. We believe that it is within the best interests of this democratic country and their future ability to retake the country to ignore the executive orders issued by Donald Trump and all laws passed on federal level, regardless of whether or not it's principally aligned with their ideologies. This is how our model look like. Firstly, in order for the debate to operate, we need to assume feasibility of state to ignore from the executive system without sacrificing their citizenship to the United States. This means that they can actually ignore the executive orders but still be a US state. But secondly, we believe that how usually state run by democratic parties can ignore all executive orders by Donald Trump. Like for example, the Muslim ban or the refugee ban. If a country like California, they can actually allow refugees to enter their borders. Or for example, Donald Trump wants to build a wall. Now these countries and these states can choose not to be a part of the wall itself. Or Donald Trump allowing LGBT marriage. These states can choose not to allow. The trade-off is that we could see that laws passed are politically, that some laws that are passed are politically neutral in nature, and Democratic Party are principally aligned with some of these laws, but we can still ignore it. Why? Because it's a minority of law that the law is actually neutral, because most laws are really different from the principle that Democratic Party believe. Even a trade-off, we are willing to trade off smaller laws and even reasonable laws because we know that the majority of the law are greatly different in principle. My argument, firstly, what's the principal problem with Democratic Party follow the executive orders of Donald Trump? Firstly, you know how the laws are greatly different in principle, and it's not a small scale, it's very large. For example, the Democratic believe that tolerance toward all races and genders. Like for example, they enacted LGBT marriage, they don't ask, don't tell, or they support ban the box, right? They're public supporters in bringing in refugees and foreign intervention. You know that the law that Trump enacted is so different from the idea of tolerance. Like for example, refugee ban or building the wall is so different from what the Democratic believe. Like as a result, choosing to follow with executive orders of Trump means you have to sacrifice a huge chunk of ideologies that they have been practicing, that they have been believing in a long time. This undermines all the progress made during the Obama administration, for example, the TPP. But secondly, you know how Trump embodies a lot of things that the Democratic Party don't support. For example, how Trump is tied to a scandal accused of obstruction of justice. When I listen to the leaders like that, this means that you share the same rhetoric as the president. You're against same-sex marriage. You're basically the same as what the president thinks. This means that you're forced to share the same rhetorics. Because in status quo, things like this already happen, and some countries already plan not to follow what Trump says. For example, like San Francisco, they believe that they should remain a sanctuary city no matter what Trump says. And the Democratic state is already prepared to ignore the law stated by Trump. Like for example, how liberal ideologies is what forms the democratic country, right? This means that the moment they choose to follow, they sacrifice a huge chunk of their beliefs, and that without their beliefs, these people is just the same as the Republic Party, and that is actually harmful because they're representing the people. They will follow on to my second issue, the second argument about how states have the right to have autonomy over own laws. Before that, yes.
So if the ideology of the Democratic Party is so strong, why are you not willing to secede for those causes?
Yeah, we will, because we believe that if their ideology, if they want to make a certain ideology we concede to them as well, because we principally believe that they're representing the people. But secondly, how states have the right to have autonomy over own laws. So meaning, in principle, how a lot of people are elected as representatives that can actually cater to their needs. People choose them as a representative because they want to be catered on. So at the point that this representative has failed, this means that they cannot provide for the people because of the executive orders or laws. This means that laws who are passed in federal level don't allow to represent the right of the people. This means that the principle of electing representatives fail, because the reason why they choose you to be representative is that they want you to represent what you think is right or wrong. Because now the principle of representatives fail, because basically you cannot represent the people that choose you. Let's see the concerns of people in the United States. Like, for example, how climate change laws, how Donald Trump pulled out from Paris climate change agreement. What happens is how many states are affected by the harm. For example, Oklahoma, right? Because they're nearly at the border of the United States. How when the sea level rises, flood come in, and these people are the most affected because they're at the borders, right? So, but these people are the most affected, but then they are not represented at all by Donald Trump administration. But in instances of Oklahoma have done to take autonomy at low level. For example, they have collaborated with Mexico and Hawaii to try to support climate change deal in the Paris, regardless of what Donald Trump thinks. You know that the reason why they do so is that so that they can protect their own people. This is what a functional representative should look like. A functional representative is when what the people want is being represented because they choose you, they elect you to represent you, right? To represent them, right? But the comparison is this. Trump isn't going to support these states. He already cut down like science, environment, and technology fund and budget. And a part of the fund is actually the flood relief fund. This means Trump have done two things. Firstly, he cannot represent his people because he basically don't care what the harm that people are facing. But secondly, he cannot help much anyway because he has cut the fund towards these individuals, and that's actually harmful towards the people who are greatly affected by his policies. The conclusion to this argument is that their side, all of this happens, and there's no check and balance towards the law of Donald Trump makes. There's no way for people who are suffering to opt out from the situation, even if they choose a representative to represent them. Because we stand on the idea that once you choose to be a representative, you need to do your job well. You need to represent what your people believe in, not just simply what Donald Trump thinks. Because your people might think think differently as what Donald Trump thinks. That's the reason why they choose you to represent them. We tell you the moment that you don't do your job as a representative, the moment you don't represent your people anymore, this is when you lose support from the ground. This is when your party gets worse. This is when people don't see you as a representative. Therefore, it's harder for you to seem legitimate for people. People don't see the reason why they would vote for you in the future. And in the best interest of the Democratic Party is that they want more support from people because they want to one day somehow take over the United States. And side government is the only side that would do so.
Yeah.
The basis of the American identity is a reliance on the value of patriotism and the ability to negotiate democracy by participating in that democracy. I think the problem with proposition in this debate is, by and large, I agree with the contention that came from Prime Minister with respect to how terrible the laws are and how shit Trump is. But what they miss in this debate is whilst you're able to maintain your citizenship and choose to be part of the United States and run away, they never discuss the repercussions of the implications of this particular decision and what the federal government is likely to do to the states, ladies and gentlemen. What will we argue in this debate? The first is why there's a principal obligation to stay. The second is the outcomes of this particular policy, right? I think the first thing that we must make clear is that what are the laws that are passed on a federal level, but just beyond the Muslim ban and the war and all that, right? I think when it comes to having to defend all laws in a federal level, proposition has to defend not agreeing to laws that circumvent things like terrorism, things like national security, things like paying tax to the federal government because it's an obligation that is mandated by law, things like giving into your state, right? But I think what they do on this side of the house is they killing the reciprocity between the states and the federal government. What is likely to occur is that the federal government is going to cut federal funding at the point where you don't give in to the very same obligations you require of them. The first thing I want to point out is I'm a little bit confused by the stance of the Prime Minister, because she says, you know what, we want them to maintain citizenship, you're going to be part of the United States, you're just going to move away. But then she also agreed in a point of information that yes, she will also want to secede in this world, right? I think you have to decide either one or the other.
Yeah,
but I think even in the way in which she illustrated this debate, it is akin to secession, right? But secondly, I think when it comes to this argument of principle of representative and your members of parliament having to represent people in the states, I think what they also have to defend is a policy of taking a referendum with these democratic states to ask people within those states whether or not they want to live. Because note, whilst you may be a blue state, you also have individuals who vote for the Republican Party and believe in those very same policies that you're transplanting out of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, the rest of my material will clash with the proposition. The first, why is there a principal obligation to stay? I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is whilst the result of the election of the United States was a disappointment by and large the majority of the blue states, that we have to acknowledge that you consented to being part of the United States at the initiation of the United States. That means that you have agreed to be with the United States, in sickness and health and all that nonsense when you marry someone, right? But the basis of this particular decision is that it's really unpatriotic in nature for you to reject and shun your country by virtue of you not liking a president. Because we will posit that Donald Trump, whilst he may be a terrible president, he's not the first president that the United States has that's problematic. So like Nixon and all these people, but they chose to stay because their ability to create changes can only happen at the point where you're legitimately viewed as a political entity, one that's viable, one that's legitimate, right? But secondly, I think what it shows to society is that blue states and the Democratic Party is acting like a petulant child. Because I think at the point where you consented to the election being initiated, you also have consented to the decisions of that election and any outcomes and policies, and you consented in trying to change, negotiate of those particular policies and outcomes, right? I think when it comes to democracy, you have to accept the fallback and attempt to change those fallbacks from within. I think when it comes to these policies, note that whilst you move out, there are people within the United States that are left behind in red states that will still be subjected to the very same policies and laws that you see are so problematic to begin with. Because I think even in red states, you still have homosexual individuals that will still be subjected to the very same laws that you say will harm them. I think in a world where blue states move out, it is unlikely that the very same people you say don't want to negotiate right now will ever want to negotiate to begin with. That's where you fail the position of representative, right? No, position of the principle of representation. But thirdly, I think it's hypocritical. I think a lot of the times, the southern states in the United States have like deep mistrust of federal agents and federal agencies and have gone throughout the federal government and have been unhappy with policies, but have never pulled out the United States and have always made attempts to change by things like lobbying, creation of laws, running for election, and many different ways, right? I think the Democratic Party can't take the hypocritical position in a hypocritical stance by virtue of them being unhappy with the results of the election. Because I think you have to start acknowledging, presumably, why the elections turned out that particular way. Moving out means you're not looking at the root cause as to why Donald Trump was elected into power to begin with, and you owe an obligation to your individuals, right? I'm going to go into outcomes now and why I think that's problematic. Yeah.
So what are you going to do about states like Oklahoma that literally suffer and people will die as a result of pulling out the climate change agreement?
Okay, see, the thing is, right, I get it. Climate change is a harm as well. But you're talking about people in Oklahoma not being able to negotiate other forms of policies that can like directly harm their livelihood at the moment. Because I would posit that on a scale, the climate change that you are talking about is a latent harm that will impact individuals later. You have to deal with the harms that will directly impact individuals right now. But secondly, if it becomes about those individuals, how do you create the kind of pressure to pressure the Republican government to go and agree with the climate change agreement if you just pull out? Because by that virtue, your contribution and your reciprocity disappears, right? What is the outcome? The first thing I indicated this earlier is that it is very, very likely that they're going to cut funding. Why is this true? Because by and large, the majority of federal funding in the United States come from red states, so money from oil, right? And they have the ability to determine where the majority of the federal funding goes to. What they do now in status quo is that by the when the blue states are in the United States, at least there's an ability for them to negotiate and an ability for them to fight as to whether or not we have the capacity and the decision-making process to be able to determine where the money really goes to. What is going to occur in their world is that the federal funding now has the ability to say, you know what, we're not going to give you any money anymore, you figure it out. Because you apparently want to be a citizen of the United States, but at the same time, you don't want to agree with any federal funding and any federal laws, because the federal funding also taps into all of the laws that you don't apparently want to follow. Things like taxation, things like building out schools, things like Medicare, all help people in the instance that they are able to access these things, right? But what's the second outcome? I think the Republicans' reaction is that it's going to anger them to the point where you say, you know what, the ability for us to negotiate doesn't exist anymore, you are a petulant child, and we are going to move out. I think what they're going to view you as individuals who are unwilling to concede, unwilling to negotiate, and unwilling to mitigate. And this very same unwillingness is going to be compounded by these particular individuals that you say are so bad. But lastly, you bolster Donald Trump as well, right? Because this is an individual who's not going to be able to run the rhetoric that these blue states that cares so much about you is unwilling to pass the very same laws that can protect individuals as well by virtue of them not liking particular policies. Given that the Prime Minister considered that some laws are beneficial to individuals, we think there's a cost to pulling out of the United States, and that costs are to the individuals that are within those states that did not consent, that did not have the choice and the capacity to make that decision. Very proud to
This debate is about which side benefits the Democratic Party. They would like to tell you that they not only lose funding, but they would have a reduced ability to negotiate. In my substantive, I will tell you the increased benefits that come from sort of separating yourself from the ideologies of Trump. But before that, I have three main rebuttals to talk to the previous speaker about. So the first thing would be about this idea about seceding from the US state, and if they're so ideological, then we should be principally okay with this. Yes, but the problem with that is that a big part of the ideology is linked to America. Literally, the Democratic Party tells people that the American people must be helpers of the world, must protect their country. So it's the very reason of being ideological that they will choose to stay in America and choose to fight against a person, against Trump, that is seen to ruin the country. We think that for the very purpose of ideology, that's when they choose to stay in America and will not secede, right? But the second thing I would like to talk to you about is how they say that there are some laws that are principally aligned with the Democratic Party and therefore it would like harm us in some way. So the first thing we will tell you that is that it's a marginal number of laws, right? Take a seat. We think that a majority of them are principally different from what the Democratic Party believes. But even for this small number of laws, we are still willing to trade them off, take a seat. Why? We think that by being subservient to Trump and agreeing to him, it still gives you the rhetoric that you are sacrificing a lot of the democratic ideology by the sheer fact that you are listening to Donald Trump, who literally embodies everything that you oppose. Just by the sheer fact that you are listening to him means that you're sacrificing a huge part of the ideology anyway. But the third thing about this principal obligation, there were two things that they want to tell you about this, is how they already consented to take a seat, right? So like this consent is quite arguable considering there's a whole bunch of reasons why they think that elections weren't particularly fair. The fact that it's based just simply on numbers, a majority of Democratic people won, how like they say that the Hillary Clinton scandal investigation was the reason why it swung towards the right, or the fact there was Russian intervention. So I think that their consent arguments is still really subjective and isn't really placed on a bet, right? But this idea of patriotism, and they say that, you know, if you're not seen as patriotic, then you would. If you're not patriotic, then you would choose that's when you would not want to listen to your government. But we think that it's the very reason for patriotism that democratic people choose to fight against Trump, because they generally believe that Donald Trump is not protecting their country and making it much worse. So from the if their principle was being patriotic, then we think that it is in the best interest of democratic parties to fight against Trump if they generally believe that their country is being harmed by that president, right? So the fourth thing I like to say is about rhetorics. Now they want to tell you that like Democratic Party would seem as a very petulant child like conservatives. So like conservatives like already think liberals are like childish, right? So under your world, you're not going to gain their acceptance or tolerance anyway. But under your world, you are going to trade off a bunch of liberals that generally believe that like listening to the executive orders of Trump would be lost, right? So like no side will have the acceptance of Trump. We consider that. But under our world, we will have more support from liberals and people who are supporters of the Democratic Party. Take a seat, right? This is the second thing. Now to my argument. Oh, before that, one.
Fact that federal taxation is a federal policy and a law that you're going to ignore under your policy. So how do you get the funding in order for you to go and lobby and negotiate and all these things in parliament?
Yeah, all right. So to my second argument to answer her question. So they want to tell you that the ability to negotiate and that the ability to negotiate will decrease because they will lose funding. So I'm going to tell you why it's better under our side. So the first harm that they have to concede to is that they will lose numbers from within their own democratic states, right? States like Illinois, Maryland, Michigan, they're all democratic by even like a marginal amount. But considering that Democrats already aggressively disagree with Trump with protests and public statements, making fun of him and throwing eggs at his buildings and whatnot, the moment that they choose to follow Trump, that's when they lose a large number of these supporters, when they realize that their party isn't really supporting their ideologies. And why is this harmful? Take a seat. So the first reason why it's harmful is that states are like less likely to be democratic in the future. Swing states will swing sharply to the right under your world because people who support the Democratic Party will choose to not participate in elections anymore if they realize that their party does not really reflect their ideologies. Like largely democratic states will be harmed, right? Because the majority of their supporters would feel as though they're not represented in the correct way. And what does this mean? This means that a Republican Party is more likely to run the state in the future, and it is harder to protect your ideologies then. But we think that what's an even greater harm, that in the future, it's harder for a Democratic Party to win the elections in the future with less people and less states that go into their favor. This means a lot of things. That we have less people in Congress to say no to other laws that come from Trump, right? What does this mean? In the future, not only will there be more executive laws because there will be more support in the Congress from people who are Republican, but they're more likely to be very hard right because there is no longer that check and balances from Democrats within the Congress, right? They are going to lose that support from the Congress, and that's when their ability to negotiate becomes worse because they're literally a small number of people that support the Democratic Party in Congress. But we think that a bigger harm is that they lose their ability to criticize. And what do I mean by this? Take a seat, I'm not thinking anymore. So like the Democratic Party is literally Trump's largest check and balance. The liberal news channels, prominent politicians like Hillary Clinton with her Ever Onward movement, right? The White House and other organizations such as the FBI are not that great as being checks and balances, considering that Trump is like literally firing them and changing the way that their state and their government is run in order to favor him. As a result of that, the Democratic Party and their ability to criticize is the big reason why Trump is kept in check, right? So what happens under their world? The moment that your state that is run by a Democratic Party chooses to be subservient to Trump and join them, that is when you lose that detachment from him. And that is when you lose your ability to criticize. That is when Trump is more likely to go ahead with all the laws and all the policies that he will implement. As a sheer result, that our Democratic Party is completely dependent on the funding that they wanted to keep. Now they have to concede to the fact that the moment that you choose to opt into these executive orders means that you lose that detachment that you have, and your ability to criticize Trump and your ability to say no to laws and show how you do not support him is greatly reduced. As a result of that, in the long run, not only will there be more laws and policies in place, but these laws and policies are going to be a lot more they'll swing more towards the right under your world, right? So in the long run, the Democratic Party they don't just lose their ideology in the meaning of being a Democratic Party, right? But they use their ability to negotiate for better laws. And in the long run, not only will it be harder for them to be in positions of power in a place where they can actually make a change, but their ability to criticize is much, much worse under your side. We think under our world, Democratic parties have a larger ability to protect their people.
Thank you.
Yes.
imagine if I have a quarrel or like a big fight with my mother, who's imaginary, right? I leave the house, and then after that I say, you know, I still want money into my saving accounts because you know you owe me an obligation. I still want to retain some form of benefits, but somehow I don't want to adhere to your house rules because they're stupid. Like, imagine if it's my mother, which I would believe that exists, she'll probably be nice and agree. But we're talking about Donald freaking Trump. And I don't know necessarily how, when they've already characterized him as such a belligerent actor, is he able to then allow you, for example, to still retain the privilege of being a US citizen, but at the same time, ignore all the federal laws and somehow are able to get away with it and still remain in the United States? Like, I'm going to have two questions in my speech. Firstly, in a weaker United States, what can possibly happen? I'm analyzing that from 4 different aspects. Secondly, talking about the longevity of the Democratic Party and why they simply cannot be trigger happy if they want to think of a long-term solution. But before that, just 2 clarifications basically. Like, firstly, if you look at the motion, the motion says this one lives that states yada yada. It's not an active debate, so we can't say what's best for the Democratic Party. But even if it's about the Democratic Party, will win. But also, government has thus far neglected what will happen to the states, what will happen to, for example, the United States, what will happen necessarily to the people that they're protecting on their ground. So we say that obviously we cannot be myopic and think of it like it's a short-term solution and necessarily we get all the benefits. They have to look at it from the long term. But also the second clarification that I want from WIC, unfortunately, is that what's the end goal? Like, they never really tell us what they want to achieve in the long run, besides saying that, for example, we have very immediate effects, we can put our own laws. But we think there are 2 questions that I have answered. Number 1, the sustainability of you continuously being excluded from the majority of the United States without funding. Also, secondly, how the hell are you going to stand for election in 4 years' time when the Trump presidency is over? They've never discussed that aspect of the debate, and we think necessarily you won't be able to participate in that, and that's ultimately harmful for the Democratic Party. But few rebuttals. Firstly, Oklahoma is a democratic state. But also they say that if you want to, for example, curb climate change, you can't necessarily get away with it because ultimately the most polluters are the Republican states. The only way you can have some form of change is when you meaningfully engage in this cause. You, for example, bring up this issue in Congress, they have filibusters, and that's necessarily how you change the law and target the people that, for example, pollute the most. So we think that ultimately on your side, Oklahoma will still be flooded, but ultimately, then again, hurricanes happen all the time. So the nuance here is that how do you recuperate from them? It's not like Oklahoma will be submerged 365 days from now onwards. So the emergency funds that are allocated, for example, for disease relief is something that is a federal funding. Meaning to say that, for example, during Hurricane Katrina, the reason, for example, the reaction is so slow is because George Bush is inefficient, is unable, for example, to allocate the proper funds to do that. Condoleezza Rice is also to be blamed. But also in this instance, when you are no longer getting federal funding, it's nearly impossible for you to be able to cope with the mass displacement of people due to, for example, environmental crisis, and you're unable to react in time. This means that on your side, more people will be displaced, more people will be homeless, more people will die from cholera and all those waterborne diseases. We think ultimately, if you really want to talk about diseases, your side has it much worse. But also, the DPM. Okay, they say that, you know, somehow federal funding is a marginal and small number of laws. You know, it's marginal and small number, like the 3 examples that they give: the Muslim ban, the war, the, for example, things that they were talking about. So all those we think disproportionately true, are harmful and bad policies, but affect lesser people, for example, compared to the majority of people who will be affected once you, for example, continuously isolate yourself from the rest of the United States. This means that everything is affected, from things, for example, like your schooling, your education, your access to, for example, Medicare and Medicaid, and also like a lot of other things that possibly affect every single aspect of your life. We can't be myopic or only focus on things that we think should benefit other people. We should also think of what it means to your own people that you're supposed to protect in the first place. But secondly, they say, oh, we'll lose votes. Why? Because somehow, for example, now that we are not opposing the Trump. I don't know what the United States have been watching, but like literally they have been constantly on the, like in congresses having filibusters. Elizabeth Warren, for example, is outright actively opposing, for example, legislative changes by legal means. So we think that people who win ultimately or are able to convince the vast majority are not your militant left, but basically people, for example, who engage in meaningful discourse and are not jeopardizing entire fate of the people in order to follow their own cause. The Democratic Party on your side will be seen as one that's using the people on the ground as pawns to further their own cause and taking people ransom in order to get what they want. We think that's ultimately harmful, and we think you're not only going to lose people who are conservatives, which you already lost, but you're going to lose moderates who are on fence, and you will even lose some Democrats who think that your ways have gone too far. Similar to why, for example, a lot of Democrats don't agree with like Bernie Sanders because they think that he's too radical. Similarly to why, for example, now people will just move away and disavow from the Democratic Party because they think that you're too radical. But also they say that they would want to deal with Trump. Like, well, from what we've learned, the way you deal with Trump is not, for example, to disengage and disrupt him in that sense, but to put him in his place and engage him in the discourse. This means that, for example, when previously you use liberal media to, for example, blast him with a lot of things, that allegations, you can simply call them fake news. But when, for example, James Comey and the Russian probe comes into play, he is forced with no choice but to immediately engage with you and are forced, for example, to really reassess the situation. This means that right now, the minute you disengage is one that allows him, for example, to feed into his propaganda, allows him, for example, to immediately isolate you on face prima facie and say that, look at these unpatriotic Americans who are willing, for example, to take people ransom. We think on that front, you lose any form of ability to moderate him ultimately. Let's move into substantive, but I was already substantive. Yeah, in the weaker United States, what can possibly happen? 4 aspects. Firstly, economic aspect. Oh yeah, go.
So why would Donald Trump remove like all funding and support from states? He knows that it harms his ability to win the next election, considering that he only won it by a marginal amount in the last.
He will know that he can remove funding because it just shows how inefficient the democratic states are running their own states, meaning to say that, for example, if the people on the ground don't have access to medicine, don't have access to all these things, they will automatically, without the help from Donald Trump, also vote against the people who are running that because of the shit situation that they're in right now. So 4 aspects of the weaker United States. Firstly, you lose the economy because obviously no foreign direct investor or no competition will engage with a fractured country that has instability, that has different levels of taxation, that has currency fluctuation because simply there's too many aspects to care about. Second idea, you lose the security. Like the FBI, the F stands for federal. So meaning to say that right now you have no ability to control your borders, you have no ability to control the security. Meaning to say that also, I think in general, IR says a fractured country is one where it's more likely, for example, for people to think that there's a lack of coherence when it comes to security forces. It's much easier for them to attack them. Thirdly, you lose allies. IR, and especially Hippocratic Western allies, really don't want to interfere, for example, in secessions. Meaning to say, for example, when Crimea happened, they're less likely to go out there and change anything. When Catalonia now is trying to secede, they're unwilling to say anything. But fourthly, essentials affected. Let's look at the longevity of the Democratic Party. We think that right now you'll be relegated to what we call a pariah party. You're one that's unwilling to compromise with the decision. You're one that are not really necessarily thinking of the long run. We think that patriotism is something that's stronger to people than bipartisanship. That every single person, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican, thinks that you are all people of the states. The minute you disavow from that and you want to, for example, form your own laws, is one where it's easier to get to your head to say that you're unpatriotic. We have survived bad presidents like Nixon, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush. We can survive Donald Trump.
If you notice the premise of this debate, that Donald Trump is someone who can't be negotiated with, who is very hard to get him to convince something, according to the debate that both sides agree on. If this premise is true that it's very hard to negotiate with him, I don't know how you can let them get away that all their benefits will accrue, that's easier to have discourse, although he's someone who's very biased, very bigoted, and is very stingy on the way he wants to provide money or taxes to individuals. You can't let them get away with that. Also, you must understand that Donald Trump is literally an anomaly within all the presidencies out there. If you want to talk about Nixon, right, just to note here, he was impeached for many reasons, and this instance is literally different. If we could do the same to Donald Trump, we just might. But this debate recognizes that if Donald Trump is unreasonable in this sense, how do we go about it as the Democratic Party, and how on earth do we uphold our own autonomy within this instance? And I've told you, a lot of things I think were ignored that they had to engage with. For instance, Tucker's speech told you why on earth autonomy was so important to protect yourself as a state, because you have a right to your own citizens or the individuals that voted you in power, and a failure to do so could literally lead to the suffering of individuals or the lack of respect for your own party. Katrina gave you an analysis on how you can garner better votes in this instance if you can please your own party members and actually show them some form of trust or faith in your party, even though times are tough like this. I think this is mutually exclusive and not available in their world, and they did not want to engage with this if you look back in your notes. No, thank you. I'll talk about a few things. I'll talk to you about, firstly, how do we uphold the democratic state better? And second issue, how do we garner back power into the White House as the Democratic Party? And in light of this, how the US light of politics will also get better. But let's talk about a few things that stand out from Patrick's speech. No thanks. The first thing I'll say is that in engaging with Donald Trump and his people, like how discourse is better. Like literally, when has this happened? The only instance, if you look back in your notes that they've mentioned, is that he gives laws like terror protection acts and stuff like that. These aren't things that he's passed in executive laws alone with you. These are things that are by constitution needed for Americans to be protected by constitution. These things are not specific or exclusive to Donald Trump's case alone, so that doesn't stand. But secondly, they haven't given you instances of when or not Donald Trump has been negotiable or reasonable in any sense. I don't see the link over here on why on earth he want to help these Democratic parties, even though he has shown in light that he's not willing to fund climate changes, he's not willing to lift up bans on the homophobic laws that exist, and even has fired judges that want to go against his laws. I think in this instance, we have to take the hard stance, because you can't fire representatives or ministers of parliament within your cabinet itself. This is harder, and we must fight the good fight in our instance as well. But moving on, he talks about Western allies being lost. Literally, Trump has lost so many people, if you understand the political climate. He's lost China. He's about to lose Russia very soon because he's messing up over there. And we think that many people actually don't want to financially or have any international ties with him, because he's being so irrational in that sense. In this case, what happens when you are a fractured state like the United States? We think he has less of an incentive to become very hostile towards everyone. He's likely to have better international relations if you aren't such a fractured situation as what we were posed to threaten over here. This is why the threatening on our side is very necessary, and I'll prove it to you right now. How do we uphold the democratic state? The premise is simple. Will Donald Trump cooperate with laws and cooperate with citizens' voices on the ground? No thanks. So he's never showed any trends, and he's never tried to negotiate. That's what we've told you. The counter to this that they've mentioned was that you can pressure laws and pressure the government. The conclusion is simple. If we can't comply with all the pressuring that's existed right now on things that are literally essential rights, like your LGBT rights, right, then we don't think that much negotiation can happen, because he feels that he has a stronger card now. How do we remove this stronger card? Is when we threaten him that we can remove a segment of his power, and then he is more likely to negotiate with you as well. We think that it's very hard to gain the benefits on your side if he remains unwilling to negotiate, because he feels that he still has power in this sense. Before I move on to the trade-offs of this, sure.
In status quo, there's already mass protests and people not wanting to engage in his policies and his executive orders. It hasn't shown that he is willing to change, and if the very same characterization you provide, that he's so petulant and unwilling to negotiate, why would it suddenly change just at the point where people don't want to follow his laws?
I already told you, he has the ability to fire individuals that want to rebel against him. This situation prevents him from firing people. You can't fire a ministry of representatives. So we think it's far more likely that there'll be higher extended pressure on him and more reactionary causes of that. But what are the trade-offs of this issue? Simple. If they claim that they want to target the people that pollute the world, states like New York City and instances like that, how do we then best have discourse? The trade-off is simple, that we have support on our own side of voters when we want to discuss with them or we want to protect them specifically. When we get this support, we think we can get the Democratic Party votes or get us in power into the White House much easier next time. Secondly, we think that we can negotiate away from your autonomous position. Just like how Oklahoma wants to negotiate with Mexico to join, Mexico and California to join the climate change deal on their own, regardless of whether the US wants to join them or not. We think these instances of showing autonomy is so important for them to protect their rights and be able to protect their citizens from these instances of threat from global causes. But moving on, the comparison is simple. Even if we need to prove that Trump will still provide some sort of benefits like taxation benefits and stuff like that, we feel that he has an incentive to, because he has an incentive to fund us because he wants our support at the end of the day. Why is this so specific to our case only? Because only when we show a willingness that something is going wrong in his administration, only then he's very panicked to reciprocate. We've seen this happen before in many instances. Let's talk about in let's talk about his white, when he wanted to pass this homosexual laws, or when he wanted to pass any laws that were very homophobic, he had to talk to Congress and he had to go pass through it many times. Even his Medicare bill, he had to pass through Congress and try to negotiate many instances as well. And we think that he's likely to do this only when he feels that he's losing that vote, and when people reject his Medicare instances for two Congress passes, right? But how do we gain back power into the White House? The premise is simple: who gets the votes? Over here, we told you that you need to gain the trust of the Democratic Party first to gain these votes, and if you come out unreasonable like them, it's very hard to do so. You can't let them get away with the premise that moderate people and Democrats don't hate him, because they all do. If you don't get their support in any instance, I don't know how you're going to keep a fractured state alive like that, or get democratic states back into power. Here.
Yeah.
We may not like federal agents sniffing into our libraries in red states. And we may have a lot more gay friends in the blue states. But above all of those differences, we were the United States. And I think when you consented to be part of that nation, you had an obligation to fulfill your part of the deal. Two things in this debate. One, on a principle level, why do we think democracy has an obligation to fulfilling the responsibility, something that goes beyond consequences? And no, this is not an active debate that is solely judged on what's good for the Democratic Party. Second, even if you don't buy that, and if you buy into their premise that this debate is about what is good for the Democratic Party and what's good for people on the ground, we will still win this debate. So first, on the principle. They said, guys, we have an obligation to our ideology. Why was that ideology in any way more important than your nation? And your obligation towards fulfilling the functionalities of your nation on a federal level? No response. Second, they said, but we need to represent the ideologies of our people, and we need to represent them. Two responses, which is like a similar idea to the first one. But essentially, one, at what point in time did you feel like you had people's mandate to represent them by going against your constitutional responsibility, like your responsibility to the state? At what point did Democrats come up and lobby for not following federal laws, not following execution laws to their senators? I have seen absolutely no trend analysis of Democratic voters wanting that from their senators and their representatives to begin with. So I don't think they have a mandate from their people to do that. But second response, let's assume that people want them to do that. I'm sorry, but sometimes in a democracy, people's wishes are not maintained because your responsibility to the Constitution supersedes your responsibility to the people. That's why in a democracy, your Constitution cannot be cannot be removed by a representative, because even the people can't vote in someone who can unfollow the Constitution, right? And yes, Mark is right. You have a constitutional responsibility to fund the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That means you are literally telling me that you will refuse, because, and by the way, which is a federal law, it is a constitutional responsibility to follow federal laws. That's literally the basis of the nation to begin with. Otherwise, how are you a nation, right? If you're going to set your own state laws, not give in to other nations and your other states and help fund them, and you're not going to follow the laws set by for the unity of that nation, how are you even maintaining your status as a member of the United States of America? And I don't think you fulfill your responsibility at that point in time. Sure.
Can't delineate from this debate. Literally, there's a difference between the constitutional rights that you must uphold and the specific executive laws that he passes. Don't hop out of this debate, please.
No, I'm not. You see, there are two parts of this debate. There's specific executive laws, which you also have a constitutional responsibility to uphold. Number two, all laws passed on the federal level. All laws passed on the federal level include federal taxes. All laws passed on the federal level include your ability to follow like uniform laws that are passed. That, by the way, this is the thing, right? Similarly, and the final reason why this is principally absolutely atrocious is because of the hypocrisy that it stenches of. Because you see, the southern states, the red states, have always hated federal agents, but they've always followed the law. You see, they weren't happy about homosexual law being passed on to the Supreme Court on a federal level. They weren't happy that they had to follow it. But they followed it, goddammit. They paid your all taxes to be able to be given to you. Because you know why? Because they're part of the United States of America. And that's as a party, you had to uphold that obligation. You had to uphold the fact that while other people were not happy with the laws you passed, they followed you because they were fulfilling their obligation. And similarly, you had the same obligation to not be a hypocritical party in this particular instance because the United States came first, even if your ideologies were not followed. Second, but let's assume you didn't buy any of that. And this debate is totally on impacts. First, they said, oh, but do we help the people? How do you help the people? When your schools don't get funding, when your hospitals don't get funding, when your roads don't get built, who are you helping exactly? The most vulnerable people within your communities are impacted the most. Even if you're going to be a selfish prick and say, hey, this is all about getting the votes. I'm sorry, why will those people whose education gets cut are now going to go and vote for you, right? You think when shit hits the fan, people are not going to blame Trump for it. People are going to blame the third party who started this fist fight to begin with, right? Because that's what happens. But then they said, oh, but Trump will negotiate with us. I'm like, give in. Okay, sure. A few responses. One, okay, but just to clarify, Trump never tried to pass a homophobic bill. I don't know why people keep saying that, right? Like the alt-right is different from the regular fundamental right. But okay, number two, Trump is a strongman leader. What does this mean? This means that the way he draws support is by showing strength when challenged. This means, for example, he did not negotiate when passing the Trump care, whatever, he tried to repeal the Obamacare bill. He got it through Republican votes alone because they have the majority. The thing is, when you do that, he will not bow down. He will respond by trying to sue you because you don't have a legal basis for responding to him. He will try all types of methods to remove you from power as a result of showing that he can stand strong to challenge us. That is the most likely outcome in a situation where you have that. And Trump would relish a warlike kind of hostility because that is the exact kind of state that allows for right-wing populism to have popularity, right? Because that's the exact kind of state where people are feeling hostile, people are feeling some us versus them mentality. It is exactly these kinds of situations where it's easy to divide and conquer. This is the kind you're playing into Trump's hands by doing this. All this bipartisanship that we had before is exactly what led to the rise of Trump because you have this kind of division growing. The second thing that we said, right? They said oh, but we can't have initiatives. They're green initiatives and so on and so forth. Okay, first of all, Oklahoma is a red state. They don't give a shit about the environment, right? I just need to clarify. But number two, green initiatives can still be followed at the state level. It's not like the federal laws bar you from following your own initiatives. You can follow that. That is why you have states like California, like they said, willing to make their own laws to follow environmental standards. So I'm not sure how that is restricted to a certain extent. But the second thing and most important is that as a large nation, and this is something they don't respond to when Patrick brought up, literally, you are screwing yourselves over as the largest economy of the world into currency fluctuations, into an unstable economy, into the fact that your freaking security is at stake because you refuse to fund the federal agents, right? Because your law mandates that for federal law mandates you pay tax for Federal Bureau of Investigation, for example, right? Or NSA. These are existing agencies that provide security against terrorism, against external threats, for your borders. All of these things are fundamental to the function of your nation. Don't let them drive you liberal crazy, right? Because unfortunately in swing states, people don't give a shit about those kind of ideologies. In swing states, people consider both sides. And those people are going to give in to this crazy batshit anti-Trump kind of movement. They're going to go and screw the Democratic Party over if you're going to go with that.
Okay. When I saw this motion, it just looks like one of those random political discussions you have over a cup of coffee at Uncle Rahmat, and then everyone decides, hey, this makes a really great motion. You know why I say this or not? It's because this bill requires proposition to disavow tax laws, security laws, border laws, and national security. Because I don't think they can get away with this uncharitable characterization of the debate of only picking one category of the motion with respect to Trump and ignoring everything else. It's a massive, crazy burden for proposition to take in this debate, right? So I think it is unfortunate and like annoying that proposition wants to run away with this analysis that, you know what, tax is a marginal law that we can do away with because we can stop the Muslim ban, we can protect the homosexuals, right? I think Muslims and homosexuals are also impacted by losing tax and reciprocity. So you also harm them, right? So what was this debate about? So let's look at the alternative facts that proposition operated on this debate. So apparently with this policy, you can control Trump, who's apparently so belligerent but are going to give it now. There's so much sway that the Democratic Party have only when they don't want to follow, so now in the Congress and all that, they don't have any sway. But when they don't follow the law, they have so much sway. I'm not entirely sure how that logic works. So, but also all sorts of law will now be stopped. And the ability for you to get more allies only exists when you don't follow the federal laws. I think all of this material is not responsive to the worst outcome of our case of you losing federal funding, right? What do we argue to in opposition? The ability for you to maintain some semblance of reciprocity when tax laws requires you as a state to give to the federal government, and the federal government then disseminates the fund to multiple different states, and that's how reciprocity works. Or the fact that a lot of these fundings come from the red states that you need to appease, mitigate, negotiate with in order for you to get that federal funding from. At the point where you say, you know what, you guys are petulant, we're also going to be petulant and not follow the laws that you have instituted, even though a lot of Republicans also don't like the policies that Trump has talked about. I think it is when you're going to lose federal funding. Don't hear, you're wrong in this debate. So who is most impacted, right? The people who are currently in the states that you say you don't want to follow the laws to begin with. I think it is not a representation of individuals. It is not an upholding of a mandate of individuals when a group of representatives say we're not going to follow the laws that the country stands for. I think at a point where people are unable to negotiate and say perhaps there are some concessions that we can make as individuals in order to ensure that we have some bargaining power as a collective to be able to negotiate, that's when you lose the mandate of the people, right? I think at a point where you are supposed to represent a community, but by saying that the only way which you can represent is by ignoring the majority that's currently controlling the narrative in that country, I don't understand why you are a meaningful representation for that country. What were the outcomes? So let's look at the first and most important. So they say at the point where you don't follow the federal laws, we are going to be able to negotiate a lot better. What was the response from opposition? We told you it is very likely at the point where you don't follow laws that you're going to bolster the narrative that Trump is able to calculate and often conflict a lot of his policies and federal laws that are necessary for people to be able to survive. You will embolden the American authoritarianism that often pushes people to extreme ends of the political spectrum, right? Literally, this is a guy who the White House staff have to fill his day with multiple meetings so he doesn't go and tweet up a storm, right? So this is the individual that you see is going to be more reasonable at the point where you don't even want to follow federal laws that he didn't institute, that he has an obligation to still enforce over the entire country, and you say, because we don't like some of your other policies, we're not going to listen to you at all. This is not going to be the negotiation that you get. But lastly, this Democratic Party, right? I think that the Democratic Party, being the banner of liberalism, is going to be tarnished at the point where you say the only way in which we can get freedom is when we ignore the systems that allow for us to access this freedom. The only way in which we are able to negotiate is when we ignore the mass amount of efforts that have been done by the Democrats and status quo in trying to filibuster, in protesting, in negotiating in Congress. I think in this world, you are going to make the Democratic Party look like shit tarts, and they're not going to be able to meaningfully participate and win the next election. It's really early in the morning. I have a headache, and I think that this debate is just one that's unsustainable because of the uncharitable position that governments want to take in this debate. Very proud. It's quite
funny how they say that first they need to rely on the funding that comes from Trump, and in that same breath say that they have a better stance of negotiating with Trump. We don't understand why, under their world, the fact that you grow that dependence upon Trump and his administration means that you have a better stance of being able to criticize him and be an able chance to like engage in like meaningful discourse or whatever that can change his ways. See, under your side, this is when you become subservient to him and you lose that ability in total. But let's talk about that, right? Because I really want to talk about how we're going to lose a lot of funding, right? So the first thing I like to say to that is that we don't think it's extreme as they want to say, like educate, like schools would be shut down, roads would not be built, and all that. We don't think it's that post-apocalyptic world that they would like to portray. So we've already explained to you how Donald Trump has an incentive to still like fund these states, the fact that he still wants to win elections in the long run, considering that he only won it by a marginal amount, the fact that he already has like really bad PR, right? So the fact that they cannot say that the Trump, like the people are going to blame like the Democratic Party in the state. They're going to blame Trump simply because Trump is the one taking the money away from them, simply because the party wants to protect the ideologies. Under their world, we think Trump still has an incentive to give some form of money. But even if they're forcing us to take this really extreme trade-off, we're still willing to do so. Why? So the first thing I like to say is that I think funding can still be made from people who will now support the Democratic Party, like people like Democratic supporters, moderate supporters, even conservatives that they also conceded the fact that do not support Trump, right? We think these are people that would compensate for the funding that they would lose from the government, right? But even if from the government. But the second thing I like to say is that their side, their trade-off is even worse. They lose because they lose a majority of people, right? Because the premise is this: liberals and moderates abhorrently hate Trump, and it's not just them; it's also conservatives that as to what they already concede to, right? So in this regard, not fighting against Trump and his administration and being completely subservient to him means that you lose a lot of these people. So they won't join the Republican Party, but they will not want to participate in elections and of the sort. So in your world, you can have all the money in the world and you can have like the best campaigns, but you will never win the election simply because you do not have the people that can support you to win those elections. But another thing about this debate that's quite important was this principal obligation. And the first thing they would like to say is that you need to protect your nation. It's like, yeah, guys, you are protecting your nation when you protect them from a dictatorial figure that literally harms your country. I think when you fight against them and fight for your country, that's when you preach your patriotic ideology more. That's when you protect your America better. But another thing they like to say is that you need to uphold your obligation to keep constitutional laws. So we have already told you, I think there's a huge difference between constitutional laws that are already placed, that are already like set in place before his administration, things that have already have been continuing for a really long time, things like taxes and all the sort. So we don't think that this debate talks about these laws, and we don't think that we have to trade them off completely, right? But even if we have to trade these taxes, we think that our benefit is that we still gain a large group of supporters from like many other demographics, and we think that and in that sense, that's when you get the benefit from a Democratic Party. But another last issue was about this negotiations thing, right? Like which side better allows like negotiations with Trump and whatnot. Opposition says two things. You need to, number one, be part of them, so it's more likely for you to like change their mindset or something like that. Or number two, you need to rely on his funding, right? So like literally, when you join the party, your ability to criticize them decreases. Considering that the Democratic Party is literally the only viable option of critique in their world, because you know every other organization and structure has been completely manipulated by Trump. We think that it's really important for you to keep this ability. Under your world, Trump will have no checks and balances, and in the future, not only more laws will be in place, but these laws would swerve largely to the right. But the fact that they want to say that they need to depend on his funding creates this narrative even more. The fact that they need to rely on the funding that comes from Trump administration means that your ability to criticize them and separate and say no to the laws is much worse when you want to rely on the money given to them. Under our world, we are okay with detaching ourselves from the Trump administration, and we think that it allows the Democratic Party to protect the nation better from the tyranny that is Trump himself.
Yes.